how will Donald Trump enforce his plan for Gaza? In his address to the Israeli Knesset and in Sharm el-Sheikh on Monday, the US president urged leaders to move past conflicts. But how challenging will that be? This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to the programme. I'm Nick Clark. So, US President Donald Trump says his Gaza ceasefire deal will bring peace to the Middle East. Some 20 world leaders, including Trump himself, signed the agreement at a special summit in Egypt on Monday. The deal outlines the steps both Hamas and Israel must take to maintain the ceasefire and to end the war. But it doesn't quite address the bigger question of what happens in Gaza beyond the next few months. What about Israel's larger occupation and the establishment of a viable Palestinian state? How will Trump's plan address these important issues? We'll put that to our guests in just a moment. But first, let's have this report from Imogen Kimber.
After 2 years of Israel's war on Gaza, the US president's ceasefire deal appears to be holding. Donald Trump says this is the dawning of a new era in the Middle East.
The momentous breakthrough that we're here to celebrate tonight is more than the end of the war in Gaza. It's with God's help, it'll be the new beginning for an entire beautiful Middle East. Can we get the documents?
The ceasefire deal was signed by the US president, the Emir of Qatar, and the presidents of Turkey and Egypt. Trump says it spells out rules and regulations. However, few details of what is in the documents is known. Trump says the reconstruction of Gaza, where nearly every building is damaged or destroyed, will begin immediately.
Now the rebuilding begins. The rebuilding is maybe going to be the easiest part. I think we've done a lot of the hardest part because the rest comes together. We all know how to rebuild, and we know how to build better than anybody in the world.
Although funding, who will carry out the reconstruction, and other complex legal issues are not clear. Governance of Gaza, beyond an interim authority that will likely include the former UK Prime Minister Tony Blair, is not finalised. And the bigger questions of Israel's control of air, sea, land and crossings in Gaza, the occupation of the West Bank, and ultimately a Palestinian state have not been addressed. Regional support remains largely behind a two-state solution.
I reaffirm our support and aspiration for the implementation of this plan, creating the political horizon necessary for the implementation of a two-state solution, as it is the only way to achieve the legitimate aspirations of the Palestinian and Israeli peoples to end the conflict and live in peace.
But the Israeli Prime Minister and many members of his right-wing cabinet do not support a Palestinian state. And Trump has refused to comment.
Thank you very much.
Before reaching Sharm el-Sheikh, Trump addressed the Israeli Knesset and praised his ceasefire deal and the Israeli Prime Minister.
I love Israel. I'm with you all the way. You will be bigger, better, stronger, and more loving than ever before.
So while Trump says he has ended a 3,000-year-old conflict, he has not spelled out how he will bring an end to the Israeli occupation of Palestine. Imogen Kimber, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
All right, let's crack on with the discussion. Bring in our guests. In Tel Aviv, we have Ori Goldberg, a political commentator. In Washington, D.C., we welcome Phyllis Bennis, who's a fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies and the author of Understanding Palestine and Israel. And in Copenhagen, in Denmark, Mohammed Shehada, who's a political analyst and visiting fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Warm welcome to each one of you. And Mohammed, in Copenhagen, I'd like to start with you, if I may. Speaking yesterday, Donald Trump hailed the enduring and everlasting peace. We're going to get into the nitty-gritty of all this in a moment, but briefly tell us how that description sits with you.
Well, every single person I've spoken to since the Trump deal was announced does not have this sort of optimism about the end of the war, the end of the genocide. It's rather the opposite. There's extreme caution, there's extreme worry that the genocide would be resumed either the way it was or by other means, especially when you have right now, Israel just declared now that it will not open the Rafah border crossing, and it will restrict humanitarian aid going into Gaza under the pretext of pressuring Hamas to release the bodies of hostages that are in Gaza, most of which Hamas doesn't know where they are in the first place. So we're seeing some reneging on the agreement. What we're seeing is two things. Number one, you're seeing Trump, Israel, etc., pretending that the war is over so that Israel would be renormalized. The pariah state that Israel has put itself into with international isolation would be broken. And you're seeing this across Europe, for example, where any talk about sanctioning Israel was suspended, even with something as simple as the Eurovision contest. The other dynamic is that Israel has created a plan B to ensure that even if its hands are tied from unleashing the genocide in Gaza with full capacity and full force one more, that it has alternative options and loopholes, one of which is not withdrawing from over 58% of Gaza, the very areas where Gaza's entire food basket is in. All of Gaza's agricultural land is in the area that the IDF is currently occupying and depopulating. And the other one is using the criminal gangs that Israel has been cultivating as a proxy force to create a civil war of some sort inside Gaza.
Okay,
and
Mohammed, we're going to get into all of that. We'll get
that,
into all of that in just a moment. I just wanted these kind of your brief opening statements, if you like. Ori, what's your sense? Donald Trump has told world leaders that the hardest part is over.
Well, that seems like your typical Trump grandiose statement that has absolutely no substantive foundations in reality. But it is true that Trump is the first to try and author an overall framework, even if that framework does not include any kind of detail. I agree with just about everything Mohammed said. For Israel at the moment, the easiest thing is to continue the killing, and it already has. It's already attacked targets inside the Gaza Strip and killed civilians and continues to kill Palestinians as regular as clockwork. I do think, however, that Trump has, as far as Netanyahu is concerned, laid down the law. I think Trump does not like Netanyahu. I think he doesn't trust him. I think he's had enough of Netanyahu. I don't think Trump cares at all about the Palestinians. I don't think the world leaders gathered in Sharm el-Sheikh cared about the Palestinians. I think that most of the leaders who are there are still very much concerned about Israel. That's certainly true about the Gulf monarchies. And I think all the leaders who were there share some sort of concern or fear over Israel's continued rampage in the region. If only for that reason, I still hold a very, very cautious optimism towards the notion that this deal might actually go forward and come to something real.
And Phyllis, what's your sense? Do you think that the deal will go forward? Do you have optimism?
I'm a little bit optimistic that the current ceasefire may hold for another few days. That's about as far as my optimism goes. I think we have to be clear about what has been signed and what has not. What was signed by the parties that were actually doing the fighting was a ceasefire, a prisoner exchange, and maybe something about the resumption of humanitarian aid, although that's a big question. This was not a peace deal. This is not a new era that we are coming into. This does not end the Israeli occupation, the siege, the control by Israel of all of Gaza, of who goes in and out, what goes in and out, control of the airspace, control of the water, all of those things. The only reference to a so-called Palestinian state was a horizon towards it and an acknowledgement that it is an aspiration of Palestinians. That's a far cry from saying there will be such a thing. And crucially, it does not stop the provision of weapons. And I think that that's the critical factor here. It may be that everything Ori just said is true about Trump being tired of Netanyahu, doesn't really like him. Maybe, maybe not. I don't think it's relevant. What is relevant is whether or not the U.S. will continue to send unlimited military support to Israel to enable another version of the genocide to continue.
Well, there's no sign of that stopping, is there?
If they're not prepared to cut it, then this doesn't matter, whatever they say.
Right. But there's no sign of that, Phyllis, stopping, is there?
No, there's not. And this has been the problem all along. We knew throughout the years of the Biden presidency, and certainly with Trump until now, all he had to do, all either one of them had to do, was say, no more weapons, that's it, you stop. And it would have stopped. The world knew that, but they were not prepared to do that. Whether these new words and the the stuff about a 3,000 year whatever is going to have any different impact, I think is very doubtful. We have a process here where Palestinians were simply excluded from having any actual role. We don't even know what's in the final agreement that was signed not by Israel and Palestine, but by 4 other countries. We don't know if it includes anything about arms. We don't know if Tony Blair is still mentioned in it. We don't know for sure. So this is all a very, very dangerous moment.
Indeed. Mohammed, just talking about Palestinians specifically, it was very apparent in everything that we heard yesterday amid all the backslapping and speeches that were made during Trump's trip to Israel at the Knesset into Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. What was very obvious was the lack of mention of the Palestinians. And of course, obviously, they're at the core of all of this.
Yeah, absolutely. Until now, Palestinians are being treated like a hurdle to remove from a road rather than the issue that needs to be addressed immediately with high urgency. You're seeing this also from European countries as well that have been treating the issue of the genocide in Gaza more or less as a PR crisis or as a crisis to manage and contain rather than a crime against humanity of formidable magnitudes. And this is likely to persist now when you have a talk about the day after in Gaza that is being articulated without a single Gazan in the room. If you look at Trump's plan, the 20 points in there, there was an earlier version of the plan that Arab countries tried to have their input added to it, and it was way much better than the one that Trump announced. Then Netanyahu went and sat down with Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner and edited the plan very heavily to make sure that it lives up to Israel's satisfaction and Israel's alone, and that it includes enough loopholes that would allow Israel to maintain the state of uninhabitability in Gaza for many years to come. So you're seeing basically withdrawal left to the Israelis' own discretion when, where, and how they would withdraw, if they withdraw in the first place. And any areas that the IDF is operating in is considered, quote, an extermination zone. That's the Israeli technical term, which means no civilian is allowed into. Reconstruction, Trump said yesterday that it would begin immediately. There's no trace of that starting whatsoever. You have the exact opposite. Israel literally saying today they are restricting the entry of aid into Gaza and not letting any sort of heavy machinery, bulldozers, trucks, caravans, prefabricated homes into Gaza whatsoever. None. Zero. And you have the last element with governance, in which you have this board of peace that Tony Blair designed the blueprint of, that would give Trump, Blair, and other billionaires the ultimate deciding power in Gaza over the legislative, economic powers, even diplomatic representation and legal powers. They would have the power over land distribution, over Gaza's marine field. That's why in Israel Channel 12, there was an article that came out 2 days ago that said that Kushner, Larry Ellison, and other billionaires are planning the future of Gaza as, quote, a tax haven for billionaires. It would be Panama #2 / the Canary Islands.
Okay. Ori, that's the thing, isn't it? Because if the diplomacy is going to fulfill the promise of the rhetoric, the question of who oversees Gaza is critical, as Mohammed has been saying. As Mohammed also said, there is this board of peace that supposedly will be headed by Trump. Tony Blair might even be involved. But has that been fully thought through? Is that the way to go?
Well, I have no doubt it hasn't been fully thought through. And I also have no doubt that both Phyllis and Mohammed are right. Phyllis with the point about the restriction over weapons, and Mohammed with the very basic point that unless Palestinians are part of this process lacks viability in a very serious way. That said, exactly because this hasn't been thought through, and because I still maintain that what this process reflects more than anything is not caving to Israeli interests, but basically telling Israel that it's out of the game, not as much as the Palestinians. Obviously, certainly Netanyahu has Trump's ear or has access to his advisors whenever they want it. But the message from Netanyahu's absence at the summit and the speech that Trump gave, a speech where he is generous, which means that he feels himself to be completely victorious. I think even Israelis are realizing that Israel has basically ceded its right to determine what was going to happen in Gaza, unless we're talking about the very immediate tactical use of Israeli slaughter tactics that we've grown used to over the past months. As far as strategy goes, Israel is not a part of the game, even though it will vet, as already said, is going to vet all the names, even though it can do exactly what it's doing with the Rafah crossing. We will have to see how this new crisis that Israel has manufactured is going to hold out. You have to remember that this is also to do with domestic Israeli political pressures. If over the next 24 to 48 hours aid resumes, I think that will be proof that despite Israel's brashness, it isn't calling the shots. And that, I think, is a big deal. Even if it is only happening for all the wrong reasons, because Masters Kushner and Ellison are planning their own personal tax breaks. Everything Mohammed and Phyllis said is true. But the fact that Israeli impunity may have suffered its first setback in, 78 years or so, that could be a big deal. I'm not saying it's a big deal right now, but that could be a big deal. It could be the biggest deal. A world growing used to the idea that Israel cannot simply do what it wants, when it wants, wherever it wants, for as long as it wants. That is probably the biggest deal there is at the moment, I think, at least at the strategic level. The fact that Israel will continue to shed Palestinian blood, the fact that Israel will do everything it can to obstruct and to disturb any kind of reconstruction, that goes without saying.
Phyllis, I think you wanted to come in.
Yeah, I think that it's a mistake to say that this could lead or indicates a move towards stripping Israel of its longstanding impunity. What we have not seen here is the word accountability. We have not seen any sense of responsibility for the genocide that Israel has committed here. What we are hearing about is the expansion of the U.S. alliance with the Gulf states in particular. The line in Trump's speech where he said that the Abraham Accords had remained through this process because they knew it was, quote, really good business. Those were Trump's words. That's exactly right. This is privileging the business interests of Trump, his own family, Witkoff's own family. Witkoff's sons, of course, are engaged in getting massive $100 million, billion-dollar investments from the Gulf states, particularly from the UAE so far, but they're not stopping there. And I think that what we're seeing is these wealthy billionaire families trying to profit from being part of Gazan diplomacy, but more broadly, making the assumptions of the Abraham Accords, the notion of normalization between Israel and the Arab states, without having to end the Israeli occupation, without having to end apartheid, without even having to end the genocide in a permanent way, without having to prohibit in a serious way any move towards ethnic cleansing in a more aggressive way than we have even seen so far. I think all of those things are still happening. And what that means is really the normalization of Israel into this, quote, new Middle East, which will involve the relationships between Israel and the wealthy Arab states, their joint relationships with Israel and the U.S., and crucially, continuing to send the weapons. I come back to this question of the weapons because this is still what will determine whether or not there is any serious effort at stopping the genocide. This agreement that was signed 3 days ago, not the one in Cairo, but the earlier one, was supposed to be a ceasefire. No more than that, really, but a ceasefire at least. What we've seen here is a return not to the day after, but to the day before. We're seeing a return to October 6th, where, yes, we did get the prisoners released, almost 2,000 prisoners that had been swept up in the Israeli raids in these 2 years. We did see the hostages released. We did see maybe the beginning of aid coming in, although now that's been stopped within the first day. But what we're not seeing is a relief from all of the things that made Gaza what the United Nations called back in 2012 unlivable.
Right.
The complete Israeli control has not changed.
Thanks, Phyllis. Mohammed, just respond to that briefly, if you would, because then I want to ask you about Hamas.
Yeah, absolutely. As I said earlier, we're seeing a concerted effort to rejoin Israel in the club of respected nations, as it could be called, or the what is called civilized nations. So we're seeing in Europe this immediate effort to pretend that the genocide in Gaza is over and to try to disappear Gaza as much as possible. We're seeing also in discussions about Gaza, the one that was held in Paris simultaneously with the announcement of the deal a couple of days ago, did not include any Gazans at all in the room. Yesterday in Sharm Sheikh, also 0 Gazans in the room. Even President Mahmoud Abbas was only present at the handshake with President Trump, and then he did not attend the actual summit when Trump was making his speeches, etc. He did not make a speech himself. So in that case, you're seeing this consistent effort to disappear Gazans. The other thing to keep in mind is that the road to the genocide in Gaza is literally paved with ceasefires and broken promises. Every single time that Israel signed a ceasefire, I lived through at least 10 Israeli military operations, 3 wars and 2 grand invasions. Every time they would sign a ceasefire that promises the end of the siege on Gaza, allowing normal life to resume, as soon as the ceasefire goes into effect, Israel does not fulfill a single one of those promises because, as Ehud Barak, the Israeli defense minister himself said at the time, nobody bothers with the details of the ceasefire once it goes into effect. No one's going to hold Israel accountable. So that element of the absent accountability is literally the cornerstone of the status quo that is being created.
But Mohammed, let me bring in the Hamas side of things here, because there is an onus on Hamas, isn't there, to fulfill their side of the bargain, to lay down their weapons and so forth, and that's critical too.
Yeah, absolutely. And you are still seeing a Hamas commitment to stepping down from government and hand it over to an administrative committee. You also have a Hamas commitment to decommissioning the offensive weaponry. There's a difference between disarmament and decommissioning. Disarmament is surrender, capitulation. Decommissioning is something like Northern Ireland, where it entails a political process. It's gradual. It's coupled with clear time frames, milestones towards ending the Israeli occupation, or even on a more smaller scale towards the Israeli withdrawal from Gaza and allowing the Palestinian Authority to return to Gaza. There is the challenge that even if you convince Hamas's leadership in Doha to disarm or decommission, how would you convince the average militant in Gaza with a weapon to hand over that firearm to the genocidal army that just unleashed a genocide on Gaza? That's why you have Hamas and mediators trying to tell the Trump administration, you need the Palestinian Authority in place in Gaza for the weapons to be handed over to it. And that's the offensive weapons, which is mainly the rockets that Hamas doesn't have an abundance of anymore. If you take even Israel's own statement from a year ago, Netanyahu said Hamas lost over 90% of its rocket arsenal. So there's none of it that's left, and there's no will to use it in the first place. But disarmament can become this elusive, abstract concept that Israel would use over and over again as an excuse to stay in Gaza and refuse withdrawal. We're already seeing it with Israel Katz trying to explicitly say that they are going to let the IDF directly destroy tunnels in Gaza, although there could be a mechanism for dismantling those tunnels. But when you have an Israeli defense minister saying our troops are going to do it directly, Israel has been using the tunnels as an excuse. Every time they destroyed a hospital or a university or an entire residential block, they claimed that there was a tunnel underneath. So we're seeing this déjà vu play all over again.
Okay, Mohammed, we'll stop you there because we've got just 4 minutes to go. So I want to bring you both in, Phyllis and Ori. So first of all, Ori, the key thing, as Mohammed was saying here, is to get a Palestinian leadership in place as soon as possible to expedite the whole process, right? And if that happens, there's half a chance.
I think there is, and I think that everything that was said in this discussion holds, and I think pessimism is well warranted, probably more so than optimism, but I would still like to insist on the role of political discourse and of, let's call it, the political vibe. I don't think Trump has changed the political vibe. I don't think this is the dawn of a new day. But I think everything that's happened so far, it's certainly true for Israel and in Israel, has introduced new variables into the equation. Am I convinced that this will go through, that there will be a deal? I'm not. I think this is a very bad deal, if there is even a deal at all. But I think we need to take into consideration the notion of political resolve, and we need to consider the political dynamic in Washington, D.C., in the Persian Gulf, and in Jerusalem as well. These are just as volatile as the situation on the ground in Gaza. and are worthy of mention in any kind of strategic discussion on the way forward.
Phyllis, we come back to Donald Trump and his influence on this, his potential influence on this, and his determination or otherwise of seeing it through. And indeed, the Vanity Project, that is his effort to win the Nobel Peace Prize, will that alone keep him engaged? Because he staked his reputation on this, especially after all what was said, the song and dance of yesterday.
Yeah, I mean, he would have to do that for another year, and he doesn't have a history of keeping one priority in his head for a whole year. So I don't anticipate that being the issue. I think that this was his big expectation, the big peace conference in Cairo being the center of what he called the wealthiest countries that had ever met before. But I think that this also does not involve Donald Trump alone. It does take place in the context of a world that is changing. Not in all good ways, with the rise of authoritarianism and the moves towards fascism in a number of countries, including my own. But I think that in that context, the degree to which Israel's role as a pariah state has been consolidated, not least at a generational level around the world, where young people are so clear that Gaza has become the moral core of their political identities these days. And that changes the environment in which at least other governments that may be more democratically oriented than Donald Trump, who doesn't seem to feel that he has to respond to that sentiment. I think around the world, other countries do. And it is changing the dynamics in the same way that we saw in the anti-apartheid struggle against South Africa in the 1980s, when country after country individually, even when they couldn't get stuff through the Security Council or General Assembly resolutions were not binding, but there were movements around the world that eventually isolated the United States position enough that the U.S. allowed the movement here to oppose apartheid in South Africa to win a victory and imposed its own sanctions on apartheid South Africa. I don't anticipate that happening anytime soon, but the isolation of the U.S. position could indeed become a factor that has to be taken into account in the United States much more than it has so far. That could be the change that we see.
All right, so much more to discuss, but we'll have to leave it there. Thanks so much for joining us today. Ori Goldberg, Phyllis Bennis and Mohammed Shehada, thanks so much. Thank you too for watching. You can follow this story and indeed see the programme again at any time just by visiting our website. Aljazeera.com is the address. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join a conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Nick Clark, and the entire team here in Doha. Bye for now.